Alright, so in a lot of ways this is going to be a little bit different than the way I normally do my messages. I think I change it up all the time anyway though, so that you may not notice. But as I was preparing this message, I really got hit with, I want to do this more of a Bible study. I know Al does things as more of a Bible study a lot because he's the historian and, he's a teacher. But I was going through a passage that I wanted to teach on, and it's a lot of reading, so bear with me today. But at first I was like, I'm just going to pick out the key verses to read out and then share the story, but God kept pulling at me, no, you need to read the whole thing, and I want you to go through this as more of a Bible study. And as I was preparing everything and doing my research on the stuff, because I actually do, I read, I don't just make all this up as I go. I saw a lot of things that I never really had considered before, and I had never thought about those things, I never read on those things, so hopefully you get some of that out of it. Like I said, it's going to be a lot of reading, but stick with me and come up with questions and comments, because I want us to get more of that spiritual application side from our discussion time. So come up with questions or thoughts you have, things that you hit or get hit with while we're reading. But I'm going to be reading from John 11, verse 1 through 7. It's the story, a lot of you probably have heard it, Lazarus being raised from the dead. I keep saying Luke for some reason, I kept typing Luke as I was preparing, so if I say Luke at any point, we're in the book of John, not Luke. I don't know why my brain is stuck on Luke, but ignore me if I say Luke. Okay, starting with John 11, verse 1, it says, "Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary, and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, 'Lord, the one you love is sick.' When he heard this, Jesus said, 'This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it.' Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, 'Let's go back to Judea.'" So this whole chapter, actually it's mostly the first part, had a couple things that when I was reading it more in depth, I was like, that's kind of weird. A guy who Jesus really cared about was sick, and he was related to Mary, who he talked about, not the mother of Jesus, but the one who was washing Jesus' feet, and they're like, why are you letting her wash your feet? She's not a good person. So that's the Mary. But people sent a message, hey, Lazarus is sick, you might want to come help him if you can. When Jesus heard that he was sick, his response was, don't worry, this isn't going to end in death. This sickness is so that God's Son can be glorified and for God's glory. And then verse 5 and 6 is what threw me off a little bit as I was studying it. It sounds a little confusing at first because he's like, he loved them, he heard he was sick, so he decided to stay there for 2 more days. Which, in my mind, that just sounds kind of weird. I really love this person, care about him, I'm concerned. I'm going to stay here and wait a while, and then I'm going to go. A lot of people I've seen have argued this was to test Mary and Martha's faith and everybody's faith that was there. But that's not really what it was that he was doing, and he talks about it in the next little section I'll read about. But Jesus had an exact moment where he was supposed to do a miracle. He had an exact moment, and that moment wasn't 2 days earlier. So he didn't say that quite yet, but that's why he was waiting. And he loved them, and he cared about them, and he didn't want them to hurt and be worried. But God's timing was a whole lot more important than, how they thought that the miracle should take place and how they thought everything should go. So I'm going to pick up back in verse 8. It says, "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you're going back?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light." After he said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but the disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let's go to him." Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Now this is my favorite section of this, because it's got some weird stuff going on, and it's got stuff that I find funny reading. I might have a weird sense of humor, so don't don't judge me too much. But basically what's happening is Jesus decided to go back to Jerusalem to go visit Mary and Martha and heal Lazarus. But the disciples didn't like that plan because they're like, Jesus, just a while ago people were trying to kill you there. Like they were actually going to kill you. So why would you go back? And Jesus' response to them was something that, like, it's another one of those things that reading it doesn't really make sense. He said, his response to they're going to kill you if you go there was, there are 12 hours of daylight. If you walk during the daytime, you're not going to stumble. But if you walk at nighttime, then you're going to stumble. So I'm going to break things up for a second. Why do you think he said that? Like, what was he talking about? I do want you guys, it doesn't matter if you're wrong, I'm not going to make fun of you too much.
Well, it kind of, if you think about it in terms like that, it makes sense if you walk during the daylight. But then it also makes sense if you're walking in the light of the Lord, you're not going to stumble either. Who knows which one he was referring to? Both?
Anybody else have any thoughts? Why would he say, in response to they're going to kill you if you go there, they probably will try to kill you? Why would he say, there are 12 hours of daylight, so if I walk during the daylight, or if anybody walks in the daylight, they're not going to stumble, but if they walk in the 12 hours of nighttime, they will stumble? So that one threw me off for a while, and like I said, I do research. So I looked in a couple commentaries. I wasn't satisfied with the first answer, but it was the same answer that I got in the second one. So then I figured, it's probably right. But basically, what he was saying is that it's what I was saying before about how there's God's timing. He was saying it's not my time to die yet. Everything that I'm doing has a set time from God. So I'm not going to die if I go there right now. It's not my time to die yet. And then it also is going into what you were saying of, he's saying, I'm doing what God wants me to do, so I'm walking in the light, I'm not going to stumble. If I don't go, then I'm not walking in God's light, so, bad things might happen, so I got to do this. And I think it's funny because it doesn't say this, but I'm 100% sure, did not understand what he was saying either. And I say that because of, stuff later on. And I just think it's funny that they write all this stuff down later on in life. This wasn't written right when it was taking place. But I'm sure at the time they're just thinking, okay, I guess we're going to Jerusalem then. But Jesus then continued by saying, and this is another funny thing to me, that Lazarus was asleep and that he's going to go wake up Lazarus. The disciples looked at him and were like, no, he's sick, he needs to sleep, don't wake him up. And so I just imagine Jesus being like, oh my gosh, they don't get this. So then he's like, no, Lazarus is dead. And then the final verse of this section, Thomas, who we call Doubting Thomas later on, he's the same one who after Jesus raised from the dead was saying, I'm not going to believe he's alive until I can touch the wounds in his hand and put my hand in the hole in his side. And then Jesus showed up and was like, here, you can touch it. But he was a loyal guy, but he was not a positive guy. When he said at the very last section that I just read, okay, let's go and die too, he wasn't saying let's go die with Lazarus. He's saying, all right, well, Jesus wants to go to Jerusalem, so let's go die with him. So I just think it's funny that was thrown in there. I'm going to continue at verse 17 through 27. It says, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection and at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and asking for you. All right, so when Jesus got to Jerusalem, he was told that Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. Basically, don't hurry, he's already been in the tomb 4 days. People are already having the funeral. Martha heard that he was coming, went out to see him. And this is why I don't think it's valid to say that Jesus was testing their faith by staying 2 days. She already had faith. She said, man, if he'd been here, he would have been healed. So she already had a pretty great deal of faith. I think she just didn't quite comprehend that, he was in charge of whether people were or stayed dead or came alive, because that just would be kind of a crazy concept that you wouldn't even think about realistically. He'd been dead for 4 days. You don't normally bring back people after 4 days. But then he said Lazarus would rise again. She said, well, I know that. We're all going to rise again. She gave the good Christian answer, even though she wasn't quite Christian yet, because Jesus hadn't died. But then, Martha gave an even greater statement of faith when, I'm going to read verse 25 and 26 again. It says, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. And he's like, do you believe this? And she gave a great statement of, yes, you're the Messiah. And that little section, this is just a little side note, to me is a very important reason why there are a decent number of people in this world, basically all of Islam and there's some other groups, that say Jesus was a prophet, he was a good man, but he wasn't the Messiah. I don't see how you can say he's a prophet and a good man when he's claiming these things. Because if he's claiming those things, then he's a liar, and, not many of the liars are considered great prophets in the Bible.
I can't agree with you.
But, so Martha admitted that she believed he was the Messiah. And I still wonder at that point if she believed that Lazarus was going to rise that day, or just with what he said, she was like, you're the Messiah, and I believe that because he trusted that you were the Messiah, that he's going to rise again. We're almost done with the reading, just a little bit more. It's back in verse 29. It says, when Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? So, Jesus called for Mary. He wanted to see her. And Mary, I think this is kind of cool, gave the same exact phrase, showing that she had faith too. Lord, if you'd been here, he wouldn't have died. So she had that same faith. And Jesus saw that everybody was weeping and sad, and he has to be taken to the tomb. And he wept there. Part of this is a cultural thing. I know we've talked about it in a couple different messages. The Jews at that time hired professional mourners. And so everybody, it's weird in our culture because you don't have it quite the same, but everybody was expected to be really sad and really vocal about their sadness. So that's why people would even hire people to come in and mourn at the funerals. But even more than that, Jesus saw that his friends, people he loved, were hurting. So it was both of those things combined. He wept and mourned with them. Even though he knew that Lazarus was coming back, he was still moved by all that, and he was also doing what he should do in that situation. Some of the Jews in the crowd accepted it as, he really loved this guy, so, he's upset, obviously. And then some of the other people, the same people probably who were trying to stone him before, were saying, this guy claims that he's healed blind people, but he couldn't save his friend. That's probably why he waited a few days to show up. And then we get to one of my other favorite parts slightly after this. And this is our last little section of reading. Verse 38 says, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there for 4 days. Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I say this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, and his hands and feet wrapped in cloths of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. So the reason I like this section is it says he was deeply moved. The original text in that words it the same way that you would say when you make a horse mad and they snort. So that to me is kind of, Jesus that time it wasn't moved in, sorrow for his friends. He was mad that they were saying, like those Jews that were trying to kill him before were saying, he can't even heal this guy. He probably didn't do that other stuff. They were basically saying Jesus was a fraud, and it kind of made him mad. So I just think that's kind of cool. Things that I just never was taught in Sunday school that's how it worked. So Jesus ordered them, directly after that, he got kind of mad at him, and he ordered him to move the stone away from the tomb. Obviously, people probably thought, he's really upset. It's one of those things where even nowadays, if somebody dies that you're really close to and you never got to see the body, a lot of times people want to see, they don't believe it. So I think that's what they were thinking. They're like, Jesus, he's been dead a few days. It's not going to be pretty. You don't want to go in there. But he said, if you want to see God's glory, you're going to move that stone. So they moved it, and then Jesus thanked God for hearing him and said, I know that you hear me, but this is so that they know that, or for your glory. And then he called out to Lazarus, and Lazarus came out of the tomb all wrapped up like a mummy. And everybody witnessed him return to life. In my mind, what I was thinking after this was, if Jesus had gotten there early when everybody else said he should, it would have been easy for those same Jews to say, well, Lazarus is probably getting better already, he got better on his own. And if he got there just after death, say he got there, right when he died, it'd be another one of those things. Back then, they didn't have that same good science we have to know when somebody's really dead. So people they thought regularly were dead who weren't, they were just unconscious. So they could have said, oh, well, he wasn't really dead. But Jesus waited until the body had already begun to decay, until it was way past the point where you can make any excuses. And so it made it clear that Jesus had those keys to death, and that death had lost its sting. And in a lot of ways, it was the foreshadowing of the future resurrection that we have in Christ, that, we have that same salvation, that same hope of no matter how far in the grave we are, once he comes back, he has those keys to death. Now, this is just a little quick side note. I always like to make these because I think it's important, and a lot of churches don't. And then we'll get into our discussion time. The women were the main ones listed as the witnesses of this miracle. It doesn't list the names of anybody else who was directly there and saw it, which may not be a big deal to us nowadays because, nowadays if a woman in court says it happened, they take her word for it. But back then, a woman's word wasn't counted. You had to have a couple men to say it, not a couple women. So, Jesus didn't care really about, and the writers of the New Testament didn't care a lot about the cultural constraints at the time saying, women don't matter. They listed women regularly, and that's why I talk about it multiple times. Jesus showed that he cared and elevated women above the social status that they were given. So I just like to point that out because I know a lot of churches try to say that women don't have those same levels of, worth. So now I want to go into the just time of discussion, what you thought about it. Give me the spiritual application from your point of view, what God speaks to you through this story, and just even through the time of worship before this story, what God's spoken to you. Or just comments. It doesn't have to be spiritual either.
I want to ask a question.
Go for it.
How do they know that Mary is the one that washed his feet?
Well, the disciples would have been there for both events, so they would have, and Jesus was apparently close to that whole family.
Yeah, but I thought the New Testament didn't make it clear that which Mary it was that washed his feet. I mean, that's what I've always thought. I've always wondered about it.
This section seems to make it clear that it's the same one, so...
What Bible do you have?
That one is NIV, and I read the NASB studies as well for it. I believe it was what it was. But I may be wrong on that. Maybe it's only the more modern.
I've always wondered,
But my thought on a lot of that is the disciples that wrote it would have been there and seen both events, so...
I just always thought they didn't make it clear. And some theologians think that Mary Magdalene was young, and then that some of them think she was older because she had money and Jesus depended on her advice and all. So, it's...
Well, some of that,
It's the Marys, and I just wondered how they came, that this was the Mary.
Now, I don't know the part where it says this is the same Mary who washed his feet is in the original translations. I didn't look into that,
Yeah.
but I mean, it just seemed in those versions and the studies that I did, it was in
Well,
there.
I mean, in whichever Bible was on the screen, that's what it said in the parentheses.
Yeah. I think she used ESV is what's on there. But
Got New King James, it uses the same thing.
That's it.
so that one to me, I mean, knowing who it was would just be the fact that the witnesses there would have been there for both of them for a lot of situations.
Yeah.
Any other things you got from it? Audra was my inspiration for this one, so she should have some spiritual comments.
Want to put her on the spot there.
Well, hey, she put me on the spot. She's like, I asked her what I should talk about, and she said this, and I was like, I don't know. Or she said something, I was like, I don't know. And then she got sad, and she's like, you never listen. So, so now I'm going to put her on the spot, and she's got to be spiritual.
Never listen.
Well, what'd you get from it?
I think it's just hilarious that the non-believers then, who were pretending to be believers, the ones now, it's like, you have to show me. It's got to be physical proof. You know, it's like, I joke with some people, if I told you the sky was blue, you'd still have to go out there and look. It's just, so it doesn't matter if it was then or now. You know.
It's really not blue, it's just refracted light.
There you go.
And
There
then
you
there's
go.
that one.
There's that one. So, I mean, they just, you know, oh, you saw a miracle. Well, I didn't see it, so it didn't happen. It's just, they're everywhere.
Well, I mean, there were all those things where even though when Jesus was crucified and they put him in the tomb and then he rose, they had all the Roman guards and they actually had some of the Jewish people watching too. And they still said, well, somebody stole the body, So it's that sort of thing. I didn't see him raised, so,
Exactly. I didn't see it. It didn't happen. Okay.
But that's where I think too, I think we've talked about it in small group. I don't know that we've talked about it in here. To me, from just the stuff I've seen in life, you have to willfully ignore certain things that are evident to say that there is no God. I think one of my favorite stories is my mom's former boss. He has 2 doctorates and, he's a really intelligent man. His first doctorate was before he became a Christian. He was a professor for years. He became a Christian because a dragonfly landed on his leg. He was a devout atheist. He was like, there's no God. The dragonfly landed on his leg and he was sitting there watching it for a while and he just sat there and he's like, there's no way. There's no way that this is an accident. This is way more complex than anything I could design. He's like, this can't be an accident. This can't just have taken place. And I think about that all the time too. We're made of billions of cells that are all, they're not independent things, but they're all basically independent life forms and they make us, and there's billions of them. And then we rely on, millions and millions of bacteria that aren't part of us to survive. Just to digest food, you need those millions of bacteria inside of you. So, I just don't see any way that makes sense. No matter how many million years you add to the timeline, that it can all add up to there wasn't a designer in there somewhere.
Put that together. Who thought of that stuff?
Any other thoughts from the story? I'm still waiting on you to come up with a comment.
That's like verse 4. This is really stood out to me. Is the truth of it. The sickness went on and ended in death. So, as far as application, that's true for us. No matter what situation, it's not going to end in death. Even if ultimately resurrection in the end, God's on our side. He'll work it all out for good, and for His glory. He's going to get credit for all the goodness that comes from it.
Yeah, and I think, not saying that I would say Jesus is incredible either way, but, without the resurrection stories of Jesus raising people like Lazarus, it'd be a lot harder to believe that there's an end resurrection. But, he made it credible to the people back then by saying, look, I can raise somebody who's been dead for a few days, who's already started to decay. Like, what I'm saying, I hold the keys to death. So, it doesn't end in death like he said.
Yeah, I think eventually one day they're gonna go, well, or the thought passes through their minds, even that day. Well, one day Lazarus really is gonna be gone and die, and, you know, we'll really miss him and we'll be sad, but, maybe after Jesus rose from the dead, they got it, like, oh yeah, we're gonna be with him forever, we don't have to fear death anymore.
That's why I really like the Martha's confession of faith. Like, oh, I know it's gonna happen in the end, but she's like,
Yeah.
kind of right now he's dead.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
Still nothing?
Someone who gave me the whole idea for the message, and you can't even come up with a good comment about it.
She's not gonna say anything unless the Lord speaks to her. You know that about Audra now.
All right. Well, anybody else have anything before we close out? All right. Dear Lord, we just thank you for each and every person in here, and we thank you that we know you're here with us in this service. And just help us to continue to study your word and get to know you more through your word. And we just thank you that we don't have to worry about death as the final solution, that we know we have life after you. In your name we pray. Amen.